Yes. Today we're diving into a really important area for anyone studying psychology, schizophrenia. We've got this student revision guide here. It lays out some of the major psychological and biological explanations, plus it takes a look at drug therapies. Our mission really in this deep dive is to slice through these pages, break down these, sometimes really complex theories, weigh up the evidence, and figure out what's truly essential for you to grasp.
Yeah, absolutely. Schizophrenia is, it's notoriously challenging, isn't it?
Mm.
And often misunderstood. This source, it gives a pretty helpful map through the different ways researchers and clinicians have tried to get a handle on it. From those early ideas about family dynamics right through to brain chemistry, genetics, and how medication fits into the picture, it really highlights that there's no single simple answer.
And that's kind of our starting point, isn't it? This complexity. Jumping straight in, the material emphasizes right from the get-go that schizophrenia is multifaceted,
Right.
that no one explanation cuts it. It points towards, well, multiple factors likely being involved.
Absolutely. Thinking about it as complex, with multiple contributing factors, that's fundamental. It immediately steers us away from looking for like a single cause, and it opens the door to these interactionist models, like the diathesis stress approach, which, yeah, we'll definitely need to touch on later. It's pretty much the modern way of thinking about this.
Okay, so let's start with some of those maybe early attempts at understanding, particularly the psychological explanations rooted in family dynamics. These theories really looked at the environment, didn't they? Especially early family life as a potential contributor, focusing on this idea of dysfunctional communication patterns. One you'll definitely bump into when studying the history of psych is the schizophrenogenic mother theory from Reichman back in 1948. Based on clinical observations then, the idea was that a mother who was, cold, rejecting, controlling, fostering this tense, secretive environment could essentially cause schizophrenia in her child,
Yeah.
leading to paranoia and psychosis.
hmm And what's absolutely crucial to understand about that theory, which the revision guide rightly flags, is that it's now, it's largely rejected by the mental health community completely. It's seen as historically significant, sure, for introducing environmental factors, but ultimately it's scientifically unsupported and, importantly, just incredibly unfair and damaging. It places blame squarely on parents, specifically mothers.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
It's a powerful example of how theories evolve, As we gather more evidence, refine our understanding, we move on.
Right, exactly. It's a historical landmark, but not where we are now. So following that, Bateson and his colleagues, this was 1972, they proposed the double-bind theory. This wasn't just about the mother, but confusing communication patterns, like across the whole family system. The core idea was a child would get these contradictory messages. Maybe a parent says, "I love you," but then physically recoils, or encourages independence, but then punishes the kid for trying it.
It's a real trap.
Yeah, the child feels trapped, can't comment on the inconsistency, leads to this sense of confusion. Maybe the world feels dangerous, unpredictable. And this was thought to potentially manifest as, well, disorganized thinking and paranoid delusions.
And it's important to note, as Bateson himself did, he saw this as a risk factor, not a direct cause, something that could contribute in someone already vulnerable.
So a slight shift.
It was a step away from that direct blame, yeah.
Yeah.
Shifting focus to the communication dynamic itself.
Okay, so a bit of a progression there. Now, a family-focused theory that still holds maybe more weight today, especially around managing the disorder, is expressed emotion, or E. Vaughan and Leff, 1967. This isn't so much about causing schizophrenia initially, although the source does suggest it may play some role in onset, but it's really strongly linked to the course of the illness, how things go. High E environments are characterized by significant levels of criticism, hostility, maybe emotional over-involvement from family members. Living in that kind of atmosphere creates intense stress for someone with schizophrenia.
And the evidence is actually quite clear on this one. High E is a strong predictor of relapse after someone's been discharged from hospital.
Right.
It really highlights how the ongoing family environment can significantly impact prognosis, stability for someone already diagnosed. It shifts the focus from what caused it to what helps or hinders recovery.
Okay, so we have these family-based ideas. They range from the ones we've mostly discarded to those focusing on relapse risk. What does the actual research say? Is there a link between family environment, childhood experiences, and schizophrenia? Well, the material does point to studies showing connections. For instance, research indicates higher rates of insecure attachments in adults diagnosed with schizophrenia. like the Berry et al. Findings from 2008. And there was that review by Raid et al. In 2005. It found a significant proportion of individuals with schizophrenia reported histories of childhood abuse, something like 69% for women, 59% for men in their study. That's high.
It is. And crucially, those adoption studies, like the Finnish one by Tinari and colleagues, they followed adopted children from high-risk biological mothers. They found that even when these kids were raised in non-schizophrenic adoptive families, they still had a higher rate of developing schizophrenia compared to controls.
Okay, so genetics plays a role.
Definitely. But here's the really interesting bit, that risk was significantly higher if the adoptive family environment itself was rated as disturbed.
Ah, so it's the combination.
Exactly. It strongly supports that idea of a combination genetic vulnerability plus environmental stress. Classic diathesis stress in action.
But there are, like, complexities and critiques when looking at this evidence, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. A major one is the validity issue. Much of the data, especially about early family stuff or trauma, it's collected retrospectively, after symptoms have already developed.
So memory could be affected.
Precisely. It could introduce bias. Individuals might recall or interpret their past differently through the lens of their current illness. Also, those really early theories, like the schizophrenogenic mother, they were often based on quite limited, maybe biased clinical observations, not rigorous studies. And finding consistent results in prospective studies, following people before onset, that's been challenging.
So, summing that section up, while the general link between stress, trauma, maybe difficult environments, and increased risk seems present, the specific historical theories about particular family dynamics causing the disorder have largely faded. The research just didn't consistently back them up as primary causes.
Exactly right. It's vital for you as students to distinguish between the idea of environmental stress as a potential trigger in vulnerable individuals and those specific, now debunked causal theories that involved blaming families. Big difference.
Okay. Moving from the external environment, the family, to the internal world of the mind, let's dive into cognitive explanations. These focus on how individuals with schizophrenia process information differently, looking at abnormal thought processes themselves. Frith's cognitive theory from 1992 is a key framework here, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Very influential.
Frith proposed problems with two main cognitive systems. First, central control dysfunction. This is the inability to suppress automatic responses when you're trying to do something deliberate. Think about how that might show up. It could explain why someone's thoughts jump around chaotically, right? Disorganized speech, disorganized thought, because they can't suppress the automatic associations triggered by whatever they just thought.
Makes sense.
It might also explain difficulty staying on task or switching mental sets, that kind of thing.
And the second system Frith identified is meta-representation dysfunction. Bit of a mouthful, but it's basically the ability to reflect on and monitor your own thoughts and actions. Normally, this system gives us insight into our own minds, helps us understand others, and crucially lets us know that our thoughts and actions are ours. They belong to us.
So when this system isn't working right, what happens then? The source suggests it can lead to experiencing your own internal thoughts as external voices, auditory hallucinations.
Right, the classic symptom.
It could also explain delusions. You might misinterpret internal mental events as external reality, or believe thoughts are being inserted into your mind because you don't recognize them as your own. That feeling of loss of agency, too, that your actions aren't fully under your control, could maybe stem from this.
These cognitive models, they offer a really compelling way to understand the mechanisms behind those positive symptoms, even if they don't fully explain why these cognitive deficits occur in the first place.
Right.
They provide a testable framework, examining how brain processes might translate into the actual experience of symptoms.
Is there research evidence specifically backing up these cognitive glitches?
Yes, the material points to studies.
Yeah.
Sterling et al. 2006, they used the classic Stroop test. The one measures your ability to suppress reading the word to focus on naming the ink color.
Yep. Tricky one.
They found that schizophrenia patients took significantly longer than controls, which provides support for that idea of central control difficulties. And other studies, like Neufeld's back in '78 using sentence verification tasks, they've also found more general deficits. Things like working memory, information processing speed in individuals with schizophrenia. And this research tends to use controlled, objective methods, which add strength to the findings that these cognitive differences do exist.
So evaluating the cognitive explanations.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways for someone studying this?
Well, the strengths are definitely the strong research support demonstrating these cognitive differences. and their ability to offer plausible explanations for how symptoms like hallucinations and delusions might actually arise. The research methods are generally pretty rigorous too.
Yeah.
But the major limitation is that these theories describe the process, the mechanism of the symptoms, but they don't really explain the underlying cause of the cognitive dysfunction itself. Are these cognitive problems the root issue, or are they just symptoms of something deeper happening in the brain? That's the question. And like with most things in mental health, there's individual variation. It's not one size fits all.
Okay, right. Shifting gears now from psychological explanations towards treatment. Specifically, drug therapies, which kind of bridge us into the biological explanations. Medication is the most common treatment for schizophrenia, and it primarily targets brain neurotransmitters, especially dopamine. The older drugs, those are the typical or traditional antipsychotics, they were developed based on the original dopamine hypothesis, working as dopamine antagonists. Basically, they block dopamine receptors, reducing dopamine activity in certain brain areas.
Reducing the signal?
Chlorpromazine is a classic example, one of the first, back in the 1950s. Comes in various forms, tablet, syrup, injection. Doses are adjusted, often starting around, say, 100 milligrams daily. Beyond blocking dopamine, it also affects other systems like histamine, which contributes to that sedative effect. Its main action is reducing positive symptoms and providing a calming effect.
Then came the atypical, or second-generation, antipsychotics. The goal here was, well, hopefully improved effectiveness, fewer side effects, and action on a wider range of neurotransmitters, including serotonin and glutamate, not just dopamine.
Clozapine is a key atypical one, developed in the 60s, but later reintroduced specifically for treatment-resistant cases because it can be quite effective when others haven't worked.
It works on multiple receptor systems, can also have mood-enhancing properties. However, and this is a big lead ya, however, it comes with the serious risk of a blood disorder called agranulocytosis. It means patients need regular blood tests. That's a significant practical issue.
Yeah, definitely. And risperidone from the 90s is another example of an atypical. It's often seen as being as effective as clozapine, but generally better tolerated. Fewer serious side effects, though it still has them.
Right.
Available in multiple forms, too, including those long-acting injections, which can be really helpful for adherence, making sure people take their medication. The material notes it binds strongly to dopamine receptors, maybe even more so than clozapine in some areas, but its effect on other systems contributes to its atypical profile.
A more complex action.
So, do these drugs actually work? And what about the downsides, the side effects? Well, the evidence, like that Thornley review from 2003 on chlorpromazine, generally shows antipsychotics do improve overall functioning and reduce symptom severity compared to placebos. And atypical antipsychotics are noted as being effective for a significant chunk, maybe 30–50%, of cases that don't respond to the typicals. So that's important.
Yeah, their effectiveness has historically been seen as major support for the dopamine hypothesis. But as the source points out, there are critiques. Some argue the effect is more just general sedation than a specific antipsychotic action. Haley made that point. There are also issues around publication bias in drug trials, positive results getting published more often. And comparing the effectiveness of different drugs can be complex, sometimes inconclusive. And crucially, like you said, they don't work for everyone. A significant number of people are left with persistent symptoms.
And the side effects. They're a huge factor, right? Impacting quality of life, whether people actually stick with the medication. Typical antipsychotics have common side effects: dizziness, weight gain, muscle stiffness, but the long-term risks are serious. Irreversible involuntary movements like tardive dyskinesia and that rare but life-threatening thing, neuroleptic malignant syndrome.
NMS, yeah. Very dangerous.
Atypicals were developed partly to have fewer of those severe motor side effects, and generally they do, which makes them better tolerated for many people. But they have their own set of risks, like the blood disorder with clozapine we mentioned, or significant weight gain and metabolic issues with others, raising risks for diabetes, heart problems.
It's always a balancing act.
Yeah.
Between controlling the symptoms and managing these often quite difficult side effects.
Definitely.
It really highlights that while drugs are, the cornerstone of medical treatment right now, they are far from a perfect solution.
Reinforces the need for a multifaceted approach to care, therapy, support, the whole package. Okay, so stepping back a bit to explore the core biological underpinnings. Genetics and the dopamine hypothesis in more detail. We touched on the diathesis stress model earlier, and this is really where it comes into its own, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The idea that you have a biological vulnerability interacting with environmental stressors.
The diathesis stress model is just fundamental to understanding complex disorders like schizophrenia today. It acknowledges that Simply having a genetic predisposition isn't enough. It usually needs to be triggered or maybe exacerbated by psychological or environmental stress. It's the framework that really tries to integrate all these different factors we're discussing, the biology, the psychology, the environment.
Looking specifically at genetic explanations now, the principle is clear. Schizophrenia runs in families. Your risk increases the closer you are genetically to someone with the disorder. And the key point, as the source says, isn't a single schizophrenia gene, but multiple genes that together increase your vulnerability. Having these genes means you're more likely to develop it under certain conditions, not that you definitely will. Big difference.
A crucial distinction. It's about probability, not destiny.
The evidence here is pretty compelling, isn't it? Consistent across different types of studies. Family studies, like the classic Gossman and Shields data from 91, show dramatically higher concordance rates, the likelihood of both individuals having the disorder in closer relatives. It was like 46% if both parents are affected, dropping significantly for siblings, around 9%, or just one parent, 13%, compared to the general population risk of about 1%. That's a huge jump.
Massive difference.
Twin studies further underline this. Joseph, in 2004, compiled data showing identical twins, MZ twins, who share 100% of their genes. They have a concordance rate around 40%, vastly higher than fraternal DZ twins, who share only 50% of genes like siblings, at about 7%.
Yeah, and even with slightly lower rates found in some more recent studies, that significant difference between MZ and DZ twins is really powerful evidence for a strong genetic influence.
And the adoption studies, like that Tinari Finnish study we mentioned earlier, they're vital because they help disentangle shared genes from shared environment, right?
Yes, exactly. Finding higher rates of schizophrenia in adoptees with high-risk biological mothers, even when they're raised in different families. That provides really compelling support for the genetic component. The source's quote from that study is pretty definitive. Genetic liability to schizophrenia decisively confirmed. Hard to argue with that.
So the genetic link is pretty well established as a vulnerability factor. Are there any limitations, though? Caveats to relying solely on the genetic evidence?
Well, yeah. While the evidence is overwhelming for a vulnerability, it's not 100%. Even identical twins, sharing all their genes, don't always both develop the disorder, which tells us genes aren't the only factor, something else is going on. There's also the possibility that shared environment plays some role in the family and twin studies. Families often share more than just genes, obviously, and identical twins might be treated more similarly than fraternal twins, potentially inflating that concordance rate a bit. Adoption studies try to control for this, but they aren't always perfect, either selective placement, things like that. Ultimately, genetics gives you the predisposition, the vulnerability, but something else needs to happen for the disorder to actually manifest.
Which brings us neatly back to the dopamine hypothesis, trying to explain something else happening in the brain. The original hypothesis was quite straightforward, wasn't it?
Pretty simple, yeah.
An excess of dopamine activity in certain brain areas caused the positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions. The thinking was that dopamine neurons were firing too much, maybe, or there were just too many dopamine receptors, particularly D2 receptors, leading to overstimulation.
And the evidence supporting this included the observation that drugs that increase dopamine, like amphetamines or L-DOPA given for Parkinson's, as Grilly noted, can produce schizophrenia-like symptoms.
Makes sense.
Conversely, the effectiveness of those older antipsychotics, which block dopamine receptors in reducing positive symptoms, that was seen as strong support for the idea that reducing dopamine activity was key.
But the theory has evolved significantly since then, right? It's not just a simple too much dopamine story anymore.
Exactly. The revised dopamine hypothesis, proposed by Davis and Kahn back in 1991, acknowledges it's much more complex. It maintains that, yes, excess dopamine in specific subcortical areas, particularly the mesolimbic pathway, is linked to positive symptoms.
Okay, so that part stayed.
That part stayed.
Yeah.
But, and this is the crucial addition it adds, that negative and cognitive symptoms might actually be related to a deficit of dopamine in different areas, specifically the prefrontal cortex via the mesocortical pathway.
Ah, okay.
So it's not uniform across the brain. It's an imbalance, too much in one area, too little in another, much more nuanced.
That is a much more nuanced picture. Is there evidence supporting this revised view?
Yes, neural imaging studies have provided some support. PET scans, like those in the Patel et al. Study from 2010, have shown lower dopamine levels in the prefrontal cortex of individuals with schizophrenia, which aligns with that idea of a deficit in that area. Animal studies, too, like Wang and Deutsch in 2008, have explored how manipulating dopamine in the prefrontal cortex in rats affects cognitive function in ways that seem relevant to schizophrenia symptoms.
So, evaluating the dopamine hypothesis now, considering both the original and revised versions,
Mhm.
what's the verdict?
Well, its strength is definitely that drugs targeting dopamine do work for many people. And the link between dopamine affecting drugs and symptoms is pretty clear. The imaging studies also lend support to the more complex revised hypothesis. But the limitations are also significant. Critics, like Moncrief or Knoll, argue the link isn't as conclusive as it's sometimes presented. And the fact that a substantial minority of patients, maybe around a third, don't respond well to dopamine-blocking drugs, that strongly suggests dopamine isn't the only neurotransmitter or brain system involved.
That's bigger than just dopamine.
It's likely an incomplete picture, probably part of a much larger, complex neural network problem involving multiple brain chemicals and pathways. Serotonin, glutamate, GABA, they're all likely playing roles too.
Wow. Okay. We have really covered a lot of ground there. From those historical family theories and how they've evolved, through the nitty-gritty of cognitive processing glitches, to the biological engines of genetics and dopamine, and then the practical realities of drug treatments and their side effects.
It really does underscore what the source emphasizes right at the end in its key points for revision. Schizophrenia is complex, full stop. Family theories highlight environment, but are historically problematic in their specific causal claims, especially the early ones. Cognitive theories help explain how symptoms manifest, the mechanisms. Biological theories give us that strong genetic vulnerability link and point to dopamine as a key player, though, yeah, probably not the whole story.
And all of this points back to that crucial diathesis stress model of biological vulnerability interacting with environmental or psychological stressors seems to be the most supported way to think about it today. No single explanation is sufficient.
Absolutely. And successful treatment nearly always involves combining approaches, medication, often alongside psychological therapies, social support. You have to acknowledge the biological foundation, the impact on thinking, and the role of the environment and stress.
It's fascinating, really, to see how far the field has come. From theories that, frankly, unfairly blamed families to these increasingly complex models of brain function and genetics, while still acknowledging the very real role of stress and environment, it makes you appreciate the huge challenges in both research and treatment.
It really does. It's an ongoing puzzle.
And for you, perhaps the provocative thought to maybe take away from this deep dive is this. If our understanding of schizophrenia is constantly evolving, moving from these single causes to complex interactions and multiple brain systems, what are the biggest unsolved puzzles remaining? And how might future research integrate everything we've discussed, genetics, brain chemistry, cognitive function, environmental factors to develop even more effective, maybe more personalized treatments down the line? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you some valuable new perspectives on your source material.